chorale is an especially important part of the St. Matthew Passion. One chorale hymn in particular, known today in modern hymnals as O Sacred Head Sore Wounded. O sacred head sore wounded, with grief and shame weighed down, occurs 5 times in the St. Matthew Passion, but it also had an earlier life. This was a hymn, like many of the others, used as chorales by Bach that went back before his time to the time of Luther in the 16th century, and later on in the 17th century when, as the church in Germany began to develop and hymnody started to develop, many of these tunes were set and lyrics were written, often coming from secular tunes. In fact, this is no exception. O Sacred Head Sore Wounded was first composed as a secular love song by a composer named Hans Leo Hassler around 1600, over 100 years before Bach writes the St. Matthew Passion, and Bach himself used it in his Christmas oratorio. It also has many different functions within the St. Matthew Passion. Though it's used 5 times, each time it's harmonized somewhat differently. Now the chorales represent the voice of the congregation in the Passion in response to the action that is being carried on. And often in modern performances, audiences will be invited to sing along with the music printed in the program so that they can participate in somewhat the same way that people in the congregations in Bach time might have participated. However, we think that in fact they may have been listening instead, because Bach's unique contribution to these chorales, since the tunes were written by someone else and the words were written by someone else, is his unique harmonization. Bach's ear for harmony and for subtly expressing the meaning of different words through different harmonies is very powerful, and if people are singing along, then it's hard to hear those harmonies. So in our performance, we in fact will be performing them with full chorus and orchestra, with the audience listening and following along with the English words that we'll be singing in order to make it easier for the audience to identify. For an example, I'd like to play the first and the last occurrence of O Sacred Head Sore Wounded, the Passion Chorale that happens in St. Matthew Passion. The first time it comes in response to Jesus' prediction of what's going to happen at the end of the scene of the Last Supper. Jesus says, the sheep of the flock shall be scattered abroad, the shepherd will be smitten, but when I again am risen, I will go before you to Galilee. So he's predicting both the passion and the resurrection, and the response of the people is, remember me, O shepherd, when you come into your kingdom. You've done so many good things for me and fed me with milk and honey, and I anticipate and eagerly long for the opportunity to do that with you in the heavenly banquet. The last time this chorale comes is towards the end of part 2, when Jesus gives up the Spirit on the cross and finally dies after the long trial and torture and crucifixion. And here the response is more one of being stunned by what has happened and wanting to be able to understand what has happened, witnessing death, which always is unexpected when it happens, even when we see it coming, identifying and wanting to be one with Jesus in that death, and for Jesus to in turn be one with us when we face our own death. The texts are very different in that way. And listen to what he does musically. The first version of it starts with many more major chords, even though we're still in a minor key. When the same phrase happens again later, I find my page quickly here. It's quite different. Starting with a minor chord and having more minor colors to it. that phrase repeats, and then the second part of the chorale comes. And here again, in the first one, following the prediction of both the crucifixion and the resurrection, the response is this. Very hopeful, and harmonies that seem to be pointing upward with anticipation. However, in the one following the death of Jesus, so it's full of chromatic harmonies or colorful harmonies of what we call appoggiaturas, or leaning notes that lean on a dissonant note that feels like it has to resolve. In contrast to the more straightforward version of the first time. The ending is especially interesting, and it's different. The two couldn't be more different, and yet they both end on the same E major chord. See if you can tell that, even though they're starting in very different places harmonically, they both end on the same chord, the one that comes at the end of the Good Supper, the final Last Supper at the beginning of the Passion, and the one that comes at the death of Jesus. So here's the first version. Sets it at the end, we have instead what's known as a half cadence, but to the same E major chord as at the beginning of the piece. So Bach is framing the whole work with these two chorales, the beginning predicting what's going to happen, foretelling, prophesying, and the second at the resolution itself, trying to make sense of it.